Hello chess.com, my name is Tatev Abrahamian and welcome to the final video of my imbalances video series. Let's wrap up with this series with another example of rook versus two minor pieces. So in the last example we looked at a game by Mikhail Tal where the rook dominated against the minor pieces. So let's take a look at another example where the two minor pieces are doing better than a rook. Let's take a look at this game between Capablanca and Alyokhin from their 1927 World Championship match. So in this position, Capablanca plays b4, and Alyokhin takes with the bishop. Of course, taking with the knight would be deadly, because after knight d6, you cannot take, unfortunately, because after rook c8, we're winning basically all the pieces, as this rook will also hang. And unfortunately, bishop e7 in this position would also lose to knight c7 because takes, and now the c6 knight is now defended. So bishop b4 was played, and now Capablanca decides to take and go for this position. So after the exchange has happened, let's take a pause and evaluate this position. So white has knight and a bishop for a rook and a pawn, but let's see what is going on in the position. And again, we want to focus on the true value of the pieces and their potential. So one of the problems that we see is this king, and the king cannot castle so far because of this queen. Black has some clear targets in the position, like the d5 pawn, and unlike in the previous example, white's pieces are actually doing quite well, because the bishop on f4 is very well secured. After white plays something like e3, one of the knights will land on d4, where it will be very annoying, and the problem is black's rooks are not going to have any good squares where they can really get into the position of white. So we saw in the previous example where the white rook got on the 8th rank and started collecting pawns, and here once I put a knight on d4, black will have one semi-open file where the e2 pawn will be defended and the c2 square will be defended. So in this position knight e4 was played with the idea to put knight c5 and castle. So knight d2. And trade, and white just simply decides to trade black's best piece, which was the knight, and just go for this position, where he will have two minor pieces versus a rook, and no other minor pieces on the board. So castle, rook d1, obviously white is going to start piling on this weakness. And one thing we want to keep in mind is still this king, because this king doesn't have any defenders, and we still have a lot of pieces. And maybe in some position, we can think about playing something like bishop e5, queen g5, and going after this king. Because black does need to spend some resources defending this d5 pawn. Knight b3. And rook goes back. So white does not want to exchange this pawn with the e2 pawn, because if we do this, then white's rook will get into the game. So this is very much about controlling black's rooks and making sure they don't get in the game. And e3. Something like h6, trying to trap bishop, is not really going to help, because we do have a move like h4. So this bishop is not going to get trapped on f4. The bishop here is quite secure. And h6 can be a weakening move for black. And we will see later in the game how this king actually is going to become a problem. So instead, black plays queen a4 and rook c2. So now black is getting some activity. So taking on a2 would not work out, because rook a1, and we will take on a7, and this king we see will become a problem. So instead of this was played, and once again Capablanca decides to trade his opponent's active piece. So takes a pawn. Okay, so now even more exchanges have happened, and now we actually do only have rook versus two minor pieces plus queens. And this is an important thing to note in the position, because if we just take the queens off the board, if you can just imagine this position with no queens, black will be doing great here, because black will have two passed pawns. And the passed pawns will just start rolling, and because it's a knight, and knights can be very clumsy, it's going to be hard for white to really stop this pawns, and white might end up giving up one of the minor pieces for the pawns. So if we take out the queens, this is going to be a big problem for white. And this is something I mentioned in my previous video, that in endgames, whenever there are passed pawns, The rook does really well because the rook is very helpful with the passed pawns. It can cut off the king, the opponent's king, and the connected passed pawns are already dangerous, right? So if we add a rook to the equation, then it becomes a big problem. But there are still queens on the board, and there is a big and obvious target in the position, and that is the king. And as I mentioned early on, the king can become a target if we can imagine the bishop going on the long diagonal, the queen coming here, and start to attack on the dark squares. Because the king is quite lonely here, the queen is on the other side of the board, and the rook alone can only do so much. So queen c6, getting out of the pin, targeting the rook. There are some back rank issues, so the rook cannot activate. Knight d4, and now we see that these two pawns are not moving because b6 is hanging, and the queen cannot return to e6 because of the knight. And again, we see the minor pieces are actually doing really well here because they have outposts and they're very secure. The king runs away, and bishop e5, and bishop e5 carries a big threat. So for example, if I just make a move, and I just pass the move, you can pause the video and figure out what the threat is. There might be more than one, but one of them is direct. And hopefully by now you have figured out that this is simply checkmate in 3 different ways. So it's very difficult to stop 3 checkmates at the same time. And the check, okay, the check does not really do much because we can simply run away, and again, 3 checkmates, impossible to stop, so they will have to give up the queen. So for this reason, black plays f6. In this position, they play f6. So knight goes to e6, attacking the rook, and bishop d4. So now we see that the bishop went from f4, where it was very nice and secure, to the longest diagonal, where it's aiming at the king. And now, again, we see some tactical potential. I won't show you because it's coming up, so you can figure it out on your own. So white to move, another great opportunity to pause the video and figure out what to do with white. And hopefully you found the move that Capablanca played, which is take on g7, and as it is often the case when our pieces are good, that's when tactical possibilities are becoming real, especially when we put all our pieces on their optimal squares. That's when it's very likely that tactics will favor us, because our pieces are good, and you've kind of exhausted their potential, so there's something, now you have to do something with them. So of course this is checkmate. And this also does not work out quite well, as we win a piece. So for this reason, queen went back, and the knight is untouchable, so actually queen g6 was not that helpful because we cannot take. So the knight went to f5. And f4, so h6 is hanging. The knight went to d6, so it becomes very difficult for black to defend everyone. Rook e6 doesn't work. So check, e4, okay. But this is just game over. It's a very nice win by Capablanca. So if we go back to our initial position where all of this happened, like let's go back to somewhere around here. I think Capablanca saw the potential of his pieces from early on. So there are several things to note about the minor pieces versus the rook in this position. So we're heading towards the endgames, but there's still queens on the board, which was very important for white, because the reason white won was black's king. So I think what he did really well in this game is seeing the potential of his white pieces and the potential weakness of the king, which he was able to take advantage of. And another important factor is the queens on the board, because as I mentioned in the other position, if we could have taken the queens off the board, they would have been quite hurtful for white, but because of the queens on the board, white was able to create this attack, and black was just never able to push his pawns forward even after taking the pawn on a2, as we saw in this position. And this is where we mentioned that if we take the queens off the board, this position would be quite nice for black. And another thing is the rooks, when the knight was on d4, the rooks could not really activate because, okay, one of the rooks got in the game, exchanged itself, but then black got stuck with this other rook on e8, which had to be passive because of back rank issues, and white's pieces quickly got into the game and went after this king, and the king was just left defenseless because the queen went on the other side of the board, grabbing a pawn. So hopefully comparing this example to the previous one where the rook did better against the minor pieces, it gives you some kind of an idea of when to go for this kind of positions and when the minor pieces favor the rook and when the rook is more favorable versus the minor pieces. In some position it is complicated and it is very playable, but hopefully, yeah, you can think about the long-term potential of the pieces or the long-term potential of the rook, and it will help you make a better decision in your own games. So thank you everyone for tuning in and watching this series. I hope they help you with your chess, and I hope they help you with better decision making, and I hope you enjoyed all of it.